So what I'd like to show here is how to create some simple subgrade surfaces outside of the takeoff module. So all you would need here would be the surface tools module and possibly the data prep module. And we just have a couple things that we would have to set up in order for this to work. So what I'd like to show first is just the different surfaces that I have in here. So I have an original ground surface created from these contours, and if I open up a 3D surface and turn on the original ground, you can see that surface. So there's my 3D view of my original ground surface, and I also have a finished design in here. So this is my finished design. I have some tank pads, and I also have some building pads, and they are all elevated to a certain elevation, and then I just created a surface from those 3D polylines. So if we look at that in plan view, you can see the surface is just created basically from those few 3D polylines that are elevation 100 on this project. So everything's basically elevated to elevation 100. You can see each one of these is elevation 100. So once you have your finished design surface and your original ground surface created, you can start adding some subgrades to these buildings and tanks. So in order to do that, you need to set up a few things ahead of time. So if you go to your surface tab and you look for the group that says subgrade, there should be these three commands in there. If they're not in there, you just have to go to the ribbon and customize the ribbon. So if you right click somewhere on the ribbon and say customize the ribbon, you can add those to your ribbon if they're not there. So they may or may not be there depending on the version that you're using. If you are using version 5, they should be there. If you're using something before that, you may have to add them in. So the commands are apply surface site improvement and create subgrade surface. So those are the two that you need. The MSI manager should be in your surface or your data prep ribbon. So let's look in the MSI manager first, and what you need to have set up in here is you need to have a material and a site improvement set up. So I have subgrades in here, and I really just need this one by itself. I don't really need the ones for aggregate and concrete and sand. I just need a generic subgrade adjustment material in there. So you just have to create something. It's almost like a placeholder for the site improvement. So add that into your material and then go down to your site improvements, and you're going to look for a single layer subgrade. So I have these created in here. I have just a few different ones. I have a 4-inch, 6, 8, 10, 12, 18, 24, and then I have a topsoil respread, and I also have a subgrade transition. So you may or may not need the subgrade transition, but if you have subgrades that are adjacent to each other that you want to transition from one to the other, so if you have a 12-inch thickness and a 6-inch thickness and you want to go from one to the other, you can create a transition. Just make sure that you have this checkbox checked, and that will allow you to do a transition from one to the other. And then here are the subgrade adjustments that are just generic. So you say 4-inch, so you have to make sure here you put your 4-inch in, and you use the subgrade adjustment material up here from the top. That's where that comes from. So you can see each one of these. The material thickness is 6. The material thickness is 8 in this one. Material thickness is 10, 12, 18, 24, and a 4-inch topsoil respread. So once you have those set up, that's pretty much the only things that need to happen before you start doing this exercise. So you could have multi-layer ones in here too if you actually wanted to show something a little bit more in depth, but for the most part, if I'm just doing simple subgrades, I just need these set up in here like that. So once those are set, you're going to add the site improvements to these polygons. So we're going to hit the site improvement command. It's going to say what what surface do I want to add these to. So I'm going to add these to the finished design. I'm going to change my view filter to my takeoff view filter so that all my takeoff data and my finished design layers are all turned on. So I'm going to name this tank pads. And I'm going to pull down from my site improvements here, and I'm going to grab I'm going to call these a 24-inch subgrade adjustment for those pads. And the site improvement location, I'm going to put my cursor in there, and I'm going to click inside each one of these tank pads, and I'm going to add the 24-inch subgrade to each one. So you see it puts a dot inside there. So that is where this layer comes from, the site improvement markers. So you want to always try to put those on a layer so that you can always get to them, but you don't need them for much. It's more like just a placeholder. So if I close out of those and I just click on it on my properties, you can see that it's an area-based site improvement, and it gives me the information about what each one of these is. So when you're done with those, if you put them on a correct layer, you can just turn those off, and they more or less just go away on the project. So they're on that site improvement markers layer. So I'll go back into the site improvements again, and I'm going to add these. I'll just call these building pads. And the site improvement that I'm going to grab, I'll make these a 12-inch subgrade adjustment, and then same procedure, just click inside the polygons that you want. So these are 12s. I'll make that one a 12, and then for these two I can make this one, let's say we'll make it an 18 here, and then the one next to it I'm going to make this say an 8, and then this one in between I want to go from an 18 to an 8, so this will be my transition area. So I will find the subgrade transition and my improvement here, so I'm going to call this building pads transition, and I'm going to put this one right inside that piece right there, and I'm going to close out of that. So once those are created, I'm going to hit the Create Subgrade button, and it's going to ask me for a name of that. So I'm just going to call this Subgrade. The reference surface is Finished Design. That's the one that we were just adding those site improvements to. And then I want to create the surface, so you can tell it which surface that you want to go to the bottom of. So in this case, the easiest way to do this is the bottom of engineered materials, because that is the lowest point of all my materials that I have in each site improvement. So that would just drop it to the very bottom. So I choose bottom of engineered materials, and I hit apply. Okay, and now over here I should have a subgrade surface. So you can see here that there's now a third surface that wasn't there before. So what I need to do is look inside my surface here, and when you do this, you can see that you'll get a little red mark here under the finished design. So what that's telling me is that I need a recompute of my surface. So I can click on this and right click my mouse and say rebuild surface, and what that'll do now is it will actually recalculate my finished design surface, and also it will create the subgrade. So you can see the two red dots went away. So now if I look here on my surface, I should have a subgrade surface. So I'm going to turn on my 3D view, and we're just going to rotate this view, and we'll see that when I turn on the subgrade surface, I now have the hold downs that I applied to each one of these tank pads. So those were the 24s, and if I look over here, I should have the different ones that I did for each building pad, and I also have the transition piece right here too. So what we can do is, to double check this, is we can do a surface slicer through here. So under the surface tab, I have a surface slicer, so I can do a cut through. So I would just draw a line across my tanks, and I can see exactly what happened here with my surfaces, right? So if I tap this button down below, it's telling me that I have these three surfaces turned on. So you can turn turn these on and off if you want to see one or the other. So the orange line is my original ground. This one here, I have my finished design, which is this one that just goes straight across. And then I also have my subgrade. So there is my subgrade surface that I've created. And we can do the same thing through the building pads over here. So I can draw a line from here straight across through here, and we can see that same thing happening. So I got original ground is the orange, and then I come across here and I hit my first building pad, and then there's my subgrade transition from the higher one to the lower one, and then it kicks back up. So once you get those surfaces created, you're going to want to do a surface to surface. So in this case, I just have a original ground surface. So what we could do is we can create a topsoil stripped area, and that's basically just take an offset of your original ground surface and drop that down. So there's an easy way to do that. With if you have version 5.0, you should have a ribbon tab up top called macros. So what you can do is you can come into the macros, and there is a command called offset surface. So if I have a 6-inch topsoil strip or a 4-inch topsoil strip, whatever it may be, I can take my surface off and offset it from whatever surface I want to. So I want to go from my original ground, my new surface, I'll just call this OG topsoil stripped, and my vertical offset, let's just take 4 inches off of it. So I'll take minus 0.33 and just hit OK. And now I should have another surface in here called OG with topsoil stripped. So you can see it just added another one in there. And if I go to my surface slicer again, and we cut through the tank pads, I now should have an OG surface, which is the orange, and then 4 inches below that I have now created my stripping topsoil lift. So what you can do to get your topsoil stripped area is we can do a earthwork report, and we can do a comparison between the two surfaces to get that volume. So in this case, I have a surface boundary here. So that's my surface boundary for my finished design. And if I turn on my surface boundary for my original ground, you can see that that is the surface for my original ground. Now, if I was going to strip topsoil in this case, I probably would want to use this line as my stripping boundary, because I wouldn't really need to strip anything outside of that. So when we go in to do the earthwork report, we can use that boundary. So if I come into the earthwork report, and this is on the surface tab as well, I want to do a surface to surface comparison. So my initial surface is going to be original ground. My final surface is going to be OG with topsoil stripped. And if I want to choose that boundary as my stripping boundary, I put my cursor in here and choose that boundary, and I can leave everything else the same. I don't necessarily need to use materials in here, so I just want to use a volume computation. So just hit OK, and it's going to run a report, and it's going to give me the amount of cut that I have here to get down from original ground 4 inches across the whole entire site. I get 1,711 cubic yards. So that would be my number of topsoil that I need to remove. So the next step would be to do another earthwork report. And I'd want to do a surface to surface again, but I want to go from my stripped topsoil surface to my subgrade. And this would be I would call this my mass earthwork quantity for the site because my subgrade is the lowest point I need to build to, and I'm starting at the OG with topsoil strip surface, and I don't need to put a boundary in here because it's only going to use this boundary because it's already created, so it won't go outside of my finished design. So I can just hit OK here, and it's going to give me a total cut and fill. So you can see I have 4,188 yards of cut and 5,000 yards of fill. So I have a deficit of 902 yards. So I would need to import 902 yards into this site to make the cuts and fills work. So that's how you basically how you do the subgrade surfaces without having the takeoff module. So if you have any questions, don't hesitate to give me a call. Thanks.